Sarah Pink, and I'm the Director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab here at Monash University. Now in this video I'm going to introduce you to ethics in design ethnography. Now ethics is actually fundamental for us in the lab because it informs our practice at various different levels. And I'll speak about each of those in a little bit more detail. We'll also learn about them in the face-to-face sessions. Now the first level of ethics is really that hands-on way in which we work ethically with the participants in our research as part of our fieldwork. So that's about ensuring that our approach is ethical and that our approaches as individual researchers are ethical, that we understand our ethics and our ethical boundaries, where those lie for us as individuals, and also where they're negotiated and navigated in relation to the ethics of the people who participate in our research, and also the institutions and organisations with whom we might engage as stakeholders in our research or as funders of our research. So that's this very complex field of ethics where different views might actually clash with each other in the on-the-ground fieldwork context. That's where methods are situated, where we work out methods as we go along. But of course that doesn't mean that those ethical decisions and processes that we engage with on the ground, in the field, are free from other concerns and issues. So there's another level of ethics. Now for me that is the disciplinary level of ethics, which refers to how ethics are considered and thought about and regulated, or at least presented with guidelines within our academic disciplines. Ethnographers come from various different disciplines. So for example, in our lab, some of us are anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, and designers. Now each of those academic disciplines has its own particular view on ethics. I wouldn't say that they would necessarily disagree, but they may have a different emphasis, and also their emphasis may be guided because we actually use slightly different methods across those different disciplines, and also we ask slightly different research questions, we have different theories and different concepts that we work with. And all of those might have implications for the way in which ethics play out. So that's the second layer of ethics, the disciplinary level. Now the third layer of ethics is what I would call the institutional layer of ethics. Now by that I mean the layer of ethics that's actually informed and regulated and guided by university and national guidelines. So for example, in some countries there will be a national set of guidelines and agreements about ethical practice and ethical conduct in research, which then universities implement and develop through the work of their own ethical approval committees and ethical guidelines. Now at Monash University we have such an ethics committee and we submit our research proposals to them so that they can advise us on the ethics and approve our ethical conduct. Now this is important because those ethical approval applications actually give us the chance to reflect on our ethics and to look at them within those sets of guidelines. Those guidelines are meant to be there to support us, as well as to support the university in ensuring that the practice is ethical. Now finally, in the Emerging Technologies Lab, and amongst researchers with whom our work is also connected, we have a fourth layer of ethics, and that is that we ask the question about the ethical responsibility that we have as researchers trained with the skills to understand society and also to work towards producing change or intervention in society in collaboration with other stakeholders, other researchers, and also the people who participate in our projects. We ask if we also, in that level, have an ethical responsibility towards producing change that will be beneficial, that will be appropriate, that will be responsible, that will actually take the world forward in ways that might make people's lives better, different in ways that are beneficial. And also, we ask if we have, in doing that, an ethical responsibility to actually bring forward insights, ways of knowing the world, and ways of understanding and arguing that actually contest dominant discourses which might exacerbate inequalities, vulnerabilities, and and modes of crisis, like the economic crisis, the political crisis, a health crisis, and the environmental crisis that we're actually experiencing right now in the world as a whole, as I speak. So do we have that ethical, moral responsibility as researchers to actually play a role in commenting on, maybe acting in such a way as to support a world that's in crisis? This second part of my talk about ethics focuses on ethical conduct in ethnographic research. Now, this is a super important aspect of ethics, and I cover quite a lot of the questions about this in my book, Doing Visual Ethnography. I also touch on them in my book, Doing Sensory Ethnography. Now, here behind me, I have a series of books from our lab, and I will mention these in a minute. But Doing Visual Ethnography is a book where I've really tried to interrogate research methods and their ethics. And I've done this particularly because in design ethnography, and particularly in the way we've been practicing it in our lab, we do use visual methods very often. So we use video cameras to follow research participants about as they show us aspects of their lives. We sometimes ask research participants to wear GoPros. We might take photographs of participants or ask them to take photographs of their lives. And some of these methods are covered in the videos that you will have been watching and discussing with us in the online sessions. Now, in Doing Visual Ethnography, I really tried to interrogate a series of questions around consent, around how people participate in research, the kind of authority that we should enable our participants to have or empower them with to actually make decisions about how video recordings and images that they're engaged with are used in our work. So in relation to consent, then I've also designed a consent form which actually enables participants to opt in and out of various ways in which we can use video recordings of them. I think this is really important because ethnographic research is a collaborative process, and we need participants to be fully engaged in the research process with us, but we also need to acknowledge that they might not want to continue to engage with us after the research process. People are busy, they have busy lives. So using a consent form to actually enable them to make choices, not only about just giving us permission to take their images and make images with them and use those images, but also to give them choices about what they would like us to do with those images later, and if they would like us to contact them later to consult them further. Anyway, we'll talk about these questions much more in the online sessions, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of the issues around ethics in fieldwork practice. Informed consent is one of the major issues, and it's something that we will discuss with you quite a lot. There are also many other questions around ownership of research materials, how we use research materials, questions around protecting research participants, but also not in a way that's patronising, but also ethics around protecting researchers. Because as researchers, we also participate in research, although we do it in a different mode to the way that participants are part of our projects. There are many, many questions to explore. Ethics is a fascinating topic. It's not just something to get through the committee. It's actually one of the most important aspects of ethnographic research practice, and something that we can think about practically and theoretically, and something that we can advance and work on together to tailor it to different projects in new ways, but that always support both us as researchers and the participants in our research in ways that enable the research and ensure that everybody is confident, everybody is comfortable, and there's always a relationship of trust involved in that research process. In this section of the video, I wanted to mention to you some of the work that's done in the lab. I'm not going to talk about people's specific projects, but I want to highlight how a mode of working with ethics really underpins the work that we do. So to do this, I put together a pile of books that I had, which are the ones that I had with me at home, because as you know, we're in lockdown. But I felt that these were super interesting because when I reflected on the pile of books that I found that were connected to the work that I've done with colleagues in the lab and that colleagues in the lab have done independently of me as well, I realised that they really do reflect our ethical practice. Now, I've already mentioned my Doing Visual Ethnography book, which writes about some of my projects and shared projects. One of the other books on the pile is The Smart Wife by Yolandi Strangers and Jenny Kennedy. It was only just published. Now, this book is super important from an ethics perspective because it actually brings to the fore the question of gender and emerging technologies, particularly the use of voice assistants and the way in which gender is actually represented in voice assistants and the way in which they're engaged with and used and presented. Yolandi and Jenny write in a really exciting way, in a really engaging way, about the need for a feminist robot, as it says on their cover. But the point is that the gender relations implicated in our society and that might be reproduced through new technologies really need to be attended to. And it should be part of our ethics to engage in approaches that actually do attend to ethics and gender in an ethical way and bring to the fore how gender inequalities might be reproduced and to consider how we might prevent gender inequalities from continuing in our societies. This book, Atmospheres in the Experiential World, which Shanti Sumatoyo and I wrote together, also brings to the fore questions of ethics because the book is focused on the experiential world. The concept of atmospheres is very important in this because it enables us to understand how we experience the world. But the point is that a focus on the experiential world, on human experience, which is often difficult to document, difficult to show, difficult to bring to the fore, for me, is part of an ethical practice. The idea of acknowledging human experience, its importance, the feelings, the emotional feelings, the sensory feelings that form part of our everyday life, and designing in such a way that those feelings are appreciated, that they're nurtured, they're accounted for, so that everyday life worlds, as we move on to the near future, are designed in such a way to enable our lives to be comfortable, to be the way for us to live them in ways which correspond with our aspirations and the ways in which we want to feel. Very often, those aspects of life are not accounted for, partly because they're invisible or they're hard to document, hard to see, hard to bring to the surface. Ethnographic research is really important because it attends to the experiential and enables us to bring it to the surface. Now, those are just a couple of the books and the works that our lab has developed. You'll be encountering many more. Now, for the final part of this video, I want to then turn to another question, which is about futures research. Now, much of the work in our lab focuses not only on understanding what's happening in the present, it also focuses on questions around the futures, about what we don't know. Now, some of that work is covered in this book, Uncertainty and Possibility, written with Yoko Akama and Shanti Sumatoyo. Here we actually confront the question of future and the uncertainty that we have about what's going to happen next. We don't know what's going to happen next. But shockingly, I think to us, actually, many academic disciplines are pretty certain or not worried or bashful about predicting the future. Whereas from our perspective, the future is always unknown. And our question then is, how can we actually cope with uncertainty? How can we think about possibility? Again, I think this is an ethical approach. It's about actually acknowledging that we can't know what's going to happen next, and then thinking about how do we deal with that from a social perspective and a design perspective. This work is also carried through in work on anthropologies and futures. This is an edited book which I edited with my colleagues Juan Salazar, Andrew Irving and Johanna Schoberg. Now, this book attends to futures as an edited volume and it has many contributors. It brings to the fore the question of future methodologies. How do we actually work with futures? How do we contribute towards critiquing predictions about futures or plans for futures that we think might lead to social inequalities, for example? How do we research those? How do we say something about them? Might we use film? Might we use writing? Might we engage in other ways? But particularly in relation to ethics, in this book I have a chapter which is on your reading list, which is about futures ethics. It's about a futures-focused research practice, which actually asks the question of how can we create ethical research practice when our research is focused on things that haven't actually happened and that might never happen. So most research ethics, most guides to ethical research in ethnography are actually focused on research about what's happening already, what's happening in the present, that moment in the present that slips right over into the past immediately. Ethical practice in anthropology in particular is something that's always focused on putting our research into the past, so we acknowledge that what we've researched has already happened. It's not something that's ongoing or continuous in the present. But what about when we're doing research about futures, which are spaces of the unknown, spaces of the possible, spaces in which we might imagine what could happen next? So that invites us to new questions. How do we actually describe the futures of people, futures that are unknown, futures that are ultimately uncertain? How do we describe those in ethical ways? That's an exciting prospect for us to consider during this course as well. It's a new question for the social sciences. So that makes it an exciting prospect for us to consider how can we contribute to those debates? How can we think about it in our research practice as we go along? So that and many other questions are open to be considered. I want to really emphasise to you, ethics is really an exciting field of research. As I said at the beginning, it's not just something we get through the committee. It's something that impacts on our research at all levels, those 4 different levels that I mentioned at the beginning: the personal, the level of the academic discipline as the second level, the institutional level, and that questions of our ethics of responsibility to participate as researchers and to consider how our work can contribute to futures. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to talking to you in the online course.